I am Dr. Sudhnya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Department of Philosophy, Janki Devi Memorial College, and we will now be considering under Applied Ethics the topic Virtue Ethics. It is your part of your course BPY 101. Now, when we look at virtue ethics, and if we look at the definition that has been offered or presented by the Oxford Dictionary, we look at virtue ethics or virtue as a quality that is morally desirable in a person. Virtue ethics is basically a broad term for theories that have gone on to emphasize the role of character and virtue in moral philosophy. Theories of virtue ethics focused on the inherent character of the individual rather than reasons as to why an individual chose a particular virtuous action. So for virtue ethics, the entire focus has been on the inherent virtuous character, or rather the development of the virtuous character of an individual. We often come across the statement that virtue is its own reward. References to this statement can be found in the writings of the early Greek thinkers. However, it was Aristotle who in his work Nicomachean Ethics discussed virtue ethics in detail. We are now going to look at how virtue ethics was described in the early Greek times and how it has gone on to develop over a period of time. We will also look at certain broad divisions in the approaches to virtue ethics since its revival in the 20th century. Aristotle, born in the year 384 BC Greece, died 322 BC Greece, a towering figure of Greek philosophy, student of Plato, however, went on to criticize Plato's theory of forms. He is also regarded as the father of Western logic, wrote on prolific type topics like logic, ethics, psychology, physics, mathematics, metaphysics, among many other. If we are now going to look at the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, and we are going to look at quotations taken from the translation by W.D. Ross. Aristotle begins his Nicomachean Ethics. The exact dates of its publication is not known, but where he begins by describing how each one of us begins an inquiry by looking for or searching for a common good. Nicomachean Ethics is an important work of Aristotle and is connected to another work of his title called Eudaimonian Ethics as well as Politics. The work basically highlights how people should conduct their lives and lead good lives by behaving in a virtuous manner. The Nicomachean Ethics exercised an important influence in the Middle Ages. It influenced the development of medieval philosophy as well as modern philosophy. Aristotle became known as the philosopher, and this is how he has been referred to in the works of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. In the Middle Ages, there was a synthesis between Aristotelian ethics as well as Christian theology, and the best culmination and synthesis of these two we find in the works of Thomas Aquinas and his Christian theology. As far as the date regarding when Aristotle wrote Nicomachean Ethics, W.D. Ross, whose translation I am referring to and some of the quotes that I am going to be quoting, held that it is a product of the last period of Aristotle's life, and it was during his time in Athens from 335 BCE until his death in 322 BCE. The book is divided into 10 chapters, and each chapter presents Aristotle's views regarding the goal and aim of human life and how best to approach it, and also see how one can establish institutions that will help in promoting the good life. Book 1 attempts to define the subject matter of ethics and justifies his method for examining it. Book 2 and 3 concern the development of moral virtue. Book 4 discusses the moral virtues and how an individual should behave in a social and political environment. Book 5 discusses the concept of justice. Book 6 discusses the nature of intellectual virtues. Book 7 discusses the challenges that an individual faces while developing a virtuous character. Book 8 and 9 discuss the concept of friendship. Book 10 discusses the nature of pleasure, happiness and upbringing of an individual. Thus we find that Aristotelian ethics examines in detail the development of a virtuous character in an individual and the challenges that come in its pursuit and growth. In the text, Aristotle has gone on to offer a defense of the idea of eudaimonia or happiness, which is achieved as a result of human choice in search of excellence and the good life. We will now look at some important quotations from Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics to understand the nature of virtue ethics and its application in human life. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. If so, we must try in outline at least to determine what it is and of which of the sciences or capacities it is the object. And politics appears to be of this nature, for it is that ordains each class of citizens should learn and up to what point they should learn them. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. But clearly, the virtue we must study is human virtue, for the good that we are seeking is human good, and the happiness that we are seeking is human happiness. Therefore, by human virtue, we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul, and happiness also we call an activity of soul. Next, Aristotle discusses the nature of virtue. He states, virtue then is being of two kinds, intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue, according to Aristotle, comes about as a result of habit. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adopted or we are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit. Thus, according to Aristotle, a virtuous person, as we found in the number of quotations that I gave from Nicomachean ethics, is someone who has ideal character traits. These traits derive from natural internal tendencies, but they need to be nurtured. Once they have been nurtured, they become habits, and slowly they go on to become stabilized. In raising the question, what is the good? Aristotle is not looking for a list of items that are good. However, his search is for the good, for the highest good, and according to him, the highest good has three characteristics, namely, the good is desirable for itself, it is not desirable because of or for the sake of some other good, and all other goods that we are desiring, they are desirable for its sake. Aristotle then next asks, what is the function or task or work of a human being, and argues that it consists in the activity of the rational part of our soul, which is going to act in accordance with virtue. Aristotle insisted that the highest good or virtuous activity is not something that comes to us by chance. Rather, as human beings, we ourselves share much of the responsibility for acquiring as well as for exercising the virtues. Thus, for Aristotle, happiness is a virtuous activity that requires us to live according to the rational aspect of our mental make-up. We will now examine how theories of virtue ethics have grown in the 20th century. These theories are not the same as consequentialist or deontological theories. The reason being they try and examine the reasons as to why we should be good or why should humans lead a virtuous life. Theories of virtue ethics have often been characterized into three categories. Primarily, eudaimonia or eudaimonism, agent-based theories, and the ethics of care. Eudaimonism or eudaimonia bases virtues in human flourishing, where flourishing is equated with performing one's distinctive function properly. An agent-based theory emphasizes that virtues are determined by common sense intuitions that we as observers judge to be admirable traits in other people. The third branch of virtue ethics is the ethics of care, and this has been proposed predominantly by feminist thinkers. And it challenged the idea that ethics should focus solely on justice and autonomy. It argued that more feminine traits, especially caring and nurturing, should also be considered within ethical theories. Now, if we look at virtue ethics in the 20th century, virtue ethicists in the 20th century have gone on to develop their theories which are independent of the consequentialist and the deontological perspectives or theories. They felt that they had to step beyond the criticisms of these theories and present theories that were rooted in virtue as the foundation. In this respect, we've already looked at the eudaimonistic approach of Aristotle. In eudaimonist virtue ethics, virtues are justified because they are constitutive elements of eudaimonia, which is good in itself. Important thinkers like Rosalind Hursthouse went on to state that acting virtuously is acting according to our rational nature, and such actions will lead us towards eudaimonia. Philippa Foot had argued that virtues contribute towards the development of a good life. Thomas Hurka went on to state that virtues increase our well-being by helping us to act according to our rationality. Agent-focused theories, on the other hand, understand the moral life in terms of what it is to be a virtuous individual, where they are looking at virtues as part and parcel of our inner disposition. Michael Sloat, a contemporary thinker, went on to develop a theory focusing on those human characters that are good and which need to be developed. These are those characters that we admire not only in our own selves, but also we admire those persons who possess them, and those individuals or persons serve as role models for others. Ethics of care is another influential version of virtue ethics. Developed mainly by feminist writers, and especially one of the important proponents, Annette Baer, this account of virtue ethics is motivated by the thought that men think in masculine terms, such as justice and autonomy, whereas women think in feminine terms, such as caring. These theorists call for a change in how we view morality and virtues, thus shifting towards virtues exemplified by women, such as taking care of others, patience, the ability to nurture, self-sacrifice, etc. These virtues have been marginalized because society has not adequately valued the contributions of women. These three versions are just some among many different approaches to virtue ethics. Most of the writers have focused on those aspects where the standards for virtue are determined inherently as well as intrinsically. They have also looked at how an individual looks at his or her own role in society and his or her own contributions to it. Some accounts of virtue ethics have been inspired from the works of Aristotle and Aquinas. Aquinas had focused on the role of human will and the choices we make accordingly. Now we look at the criticisms of virtue ethics as a theory. The first criticism of virtue ethics is that it is supposed to be self-centered. Virtue ethics, according to this criticism or objection, is self-centered. Why? Because it is primarily concerned with the agent's own character. Virtue ethics seems to be essentially interested in the acquisition of virtues as part of the agent's own well-being and flourishing. But morality, according to them, requires us to consider others for their own sake and not because they may benefit us. So according to the first critics of virtue ethics, it is something which is very self-centered as a theory of virtue ethics. The objection or criticism, according to the proponents of virtue ethics, is misplaced so far as it being self-centric goes, because they argue that it plays a unifying role in the development of virtues. The good of the agent and the good of the society are not different from each other. Rather, they are reciprocally connected. Therefore, they say that the objection of self-criticism or self-centeredness is misplaced. The second criticism of virtue ethics is that it has failed as a theory to recognize the action guiding role of consequentialist and deontological theories. Moral theories, according to them, are all about guiding human actions and recognizing its importance in a social setup. These critics argue that moral learning is not just about developing inherent character, rather it is a lifelong learning process, and virtue ethics as a theory fails to recognize that morality and moral learning and leaning is about developing inherent character, and that is a work in progress. The third criticism focuses on moral luck. According to these critics, virtue ethics as a theory focuses on a rational agent's moral choices, little realizing that these choices are made voluntarily. No doubt, the path leading to a virtuous life is difficult, and often the choices do not rest with the agent. Virtue ethicists respond to this criticism by stating that human life is fragile. No doubt, there are a number of situations which are beyond our control, but because the good life is so vulnerable and fragile, therefore it is precious. Many things, no doubt, can go wrong on the road to pursue virtue or in the pursuit of virtue. This vulnerability is an essential feature of the human condition, which makes the attainment of the good life all the more valuable. If we look at the summarization of the various theories of virtue ethics, we find that virtue ethics has gone on to offer a completely different account of morality from the deontological and consequentialist theories. Virtue ethics has been able to influence modern moral philosophy not only by developing a full-fledged account of virtue, but also by causing consequentialists and deontologists to re-examine their own theories, and with a view to taking insight of virtues in their own theories. The emergence of virtue ethics has made Kantian deontologists to move away from the groundwork and look at Kantian ethics from the perspective of virtue ethics. Consequentialists, on the other hand, have found a role for it by stating that development of virtue leads to a good life. Virtue is valuable, not in itself, but for the good consequences it brings about. Thank you.